Even in the realm of productions of Romeo and Juliet, it is not a new idea to create casting that will bring young, new audiences to that theatre. What this one does so well is to then subsequently conceive a production that is actually for those audiences. Oh my god, hey, welcome back. My name is Mickey Jo. I'm a theatre critic here on social media, and you are either watching this video on my theatre-themed YouTube channel or listening to it on a podcast platform. Hello to you. I am currently coming to you from Brooklyn, New York, where I am staying while I see like between 20 and 30 Broadway and off-Broadway shows, plays, and musicals, and today the 30 minutes traffic of this video, maybe 45, I have been known to ramble, although so did Shakespeare, in all fairness, is going to be my thoughts on the brand new production of Romeo and Juliet, directed by Sam Gold, starring Kit Connor and Rachel Zegler as Romeo and Juliet respectively, and currently playing at the Circle in the Square Theatre on Broadway. I saw it last night, it opened recently, and I have many thoughts, both about this production and its inevitable comparison to a recent production of Romeo and Juliet that was seen in the West End, directed by Jamie Lloyd, starring Tom Holland and Francesca Amawuda Rivers. There is traffic outside of my window. Welcome to New York, everybody. That's going to happen. And invariably, I am going to talk about some of the comparison between those two productions because they have similarities in terms of their approach, but they also have hugely substantial differences. However, I think another video is coming where I fully compare and contrast the two because I think it's a super interesting case study. Both of them sort of led with celebrity casting and then delivered very, very strikingly different productions to the stage. And it is well known at this point I did not enjoy that previous production of Romeo and Juliet. If you want to know why, you can go and check out my previous review video on that one. But today we are going to be talking about this production, the Broadway production. And it's fair to say I was a little bit anxious because the concept of Shakespeare on Broadway, it's not the most established thing, and even Shakespeare being done in the US was not something I had experienced before. And coming from the UK, from a place where we have an awful lot of Shakespeare, where we have the Royal Shakespeare Company, and we have the Globe, and we have the National, and there is consistently Shakespeare happening everywhere, I don't know if I felt a little bit protective of that as a concept, or just, I don't know, I wasn't necessarily sold on how well Americans would realize that. But I am here to tell you today I had a fantastic time at Romeo and Juliet. Was it perfect? No, we're going to talk about it in this video, but the vibes were great. And this is a production all about vibes. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. But before I do, if you have seen this production already on stage, let me know what you thought in the comments section down below. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you aren't already subscribed to my theatre-themed YouTube channel or following me on whatever podcast platform you are hearing me on, make sure to do that. I have many more reviews coming soon. Turn on notifications so you don't miss my upcoming videos. And if you want to see what it was like when I went to go and see Romeo and Juliet at the Circle in the Square Theatre on Broadway, stay tuned for part 1 of my upcoming Broadway vlog series to be released very soon. For now though, let's talk about it. Why did I enjoy this Romeo and Juliet so much more than the production in London earlier this year? So let's begin with a little bit of context. This being a 400-year-old play from William Shakespeare, I feel like everyone knows the gist of Romeo and Juliet. It's also been adapted several which ways, not only with film adaptations, but also with the musical West Side Story, the film adaptation, the recent film adaptation of which by Steven Spielberg, of course, starred Rachel Zegler as Maria, which makes her casting in this a little bit auspicious. There is the musical And Juliet that tells the story of what would have happened if Juliet had survived the events of the play, that is also currently running concurrently on Broadway. There's the animated film Romeo and Juliet. There are so many Romeo and Juliet interpretations, all following the story of two star-crossed lovers who fall in love with each other in spite of this long-standing grudge, rivalry, hatred even, between their two feuding families, the Montagues and the Capulets, Romeo being the only son of the Montagues, Juliet being the only daughter of the Capulets. And we deal with a lot of emotional extremes here. Out of this abject hatred comes this overpowering love. It's this classic story of the two young people who aren't supposed to fall in love with each other, but do anyway. Out of hatred comes passion, comes beauty, comes love, comes hope, except for the fact that it is ultimately a tragedy, because it does not end well. This is not a spoiler alert. They tell you all of this at the beginning, because Romeo and Juliet, because of all of these circumstances, are unable to be together, and because they never really tell their parents, a whole lot of events are set in motion that end with the two of them sadly killing themselves, because Juliet comes up with this with the help of Friar Lawrence, who marries the two of them in secret as teenagers without their parents' consent, which is a conversation we can have, by the way. He gives her something to take that will give her the appearance of being dead, but with the plan that she will awake after a certain amount of time, because this magically is going to save everything. Unfortunately, in the intervening period, Romeo learns that she is dead, is unable to receive an important message from a messenger, and kills himself while lying on top of her. She then wakes up to find the corpse of her husband and kills herself in response. These being some of the later deaths in the play, there is plenty of bloodshed beforehand because of the rivalry between these two households. Now, this production is directed by Sam Gold, who has directed much Shakespeare before on Broadway. It is at the Circle in the Square Theatre, which is Broadway's only in the round house, which means the audience is sat all around this circular stage in the middle, it being an aptly titled theatre. And the production's immediate popularity arose from its principal casting, with Emmy Award winner Kit Connor of Heartstopper playing Romeo, and Golden Globe winner Rachel Zegler of West Side Story, of the upcoming Snow White film, playing Juliet. And immediately, I need to let you know, I'm here for all of this. I'm here for all of it, because what I think is the really great thing about this production is not only have we cast people that are going to sell tickets, and smart producing, we've cast people that are going to sell tickets to young audiences who may be seeing their first Broadway show because they love Kit Connor, because they love Rachel Zegler, because they love both of them, and this was a perfect moment for them in this Venn diagram crossover of their interests. It may be their first Shakespeare. It's probably very likely to be bringing a lot of young people to the theatre seeing Shakespeare for the very first time. And this isn't the first show to cast people to bring young audiences into the theatre. It's not the first show to do that with Shakespeare. Like I said, the Tom Holland led Romeo and Juliet earlier this year. But what this one does is it then delivers a production that actually feels catered to those young people. It brings clarity to this Shakespearean text. I'm not going to sit here and imply that everyone ought to magically be able to understand Shakespearean verse. It is complicated. Romeo and Juliet is one of the lighter ones, but it is still complicated nonetheless. In the UK, we study Shakespeare in schools. I don't know if that happens to the same extent here in the US. But you can let me know in the comments section. But like I said, this production makes it straightforward, not only the events of the play, but also the character motivations and the kind of political undertones. It's not as politically complex as one of the history plays with all of the different machinations at play in those, but there are certainly things happening beneath the surface. But critically, it also aims to engage and to entertain. The crowd-pleasing factor of this is so high, and this is kind of what you would imagine Shakespeare on Broadway to be. If you're looking for something more classic, if you're looking for something where the delivery is a little bit more rich, a little bit more poetic, a little bit more traditionally Shakespearean, this is demonstrably not the forum for that, nor do I think it should be. This is populist Shakespeare, and I have no problem with that, because it's bringing young people to the theatre, and then it's allowing them to have a good time. It's not just taking their money and then delivering something pretentious and vague and unclear that doesn't do the legwork to try and explain the text. It's all very good stripping all of these elements away, but if you're not explicating the thing, then you are doing a disservice to the young people who you have enticed into this building with the promise to entertain them in some capacity. And that is what this one does. This is giving young audiences a great time, and I had a great time. Let me tell you a little bit more about this production in the hopes of explaining why I had such a great time. So like I said, Sam Gold is delivering Romeo and Juliet with vibes here. From the beginning, we have the company taking to the stage in the moments before it begins, and they are reclining, and they are lying on inflatable furniture, and they are riding around on shopping trolleys filled with teddy bears, and they are chatting with each other, and Rachel Zegler comes on stage wearing a shark onesie and gets carried around, and they're having a fun, youthful time. It looks like a group of young people just hanging out and having a nice time. It also establishes them as players. There's something very modern, very contemporary about this, but also incredibly traditional and incredibly Shakespearean. We have our cast of players, our company, entering into the space and warming up as actors. The next thing that happens is we have this moment of music, and they're all in this huddle, and they're all dancing around, And then Gabby Beams, who plays the dual roles of Friar Lawrence and Mercutio, has a handheld microphone, which is not used extensively in the play. I'll talk more about that. And introduces the members of the company and who they will be playing, and does this all by name. Here is Kit, he will be playing Romeo. Here is Rachel, she will be playing Juliet. I love this for multiple reasons. One of them is that this is something that happens during relaxed performances, and I love that there's a way of incorporating that into every performance. This production is also very accessible because they have captioning available at performances as well, which is sort of unnecessarily revolutionary. But also, again, it's really Shakespearean. The text of this thing is not immersive. We begin with a Shakespearean introduction per the text that tells you exactly what is going to happen in this play. They tell you this is going to be 2 hours long, and these two are going to fall in love even though their families hate each other, and then they're going to die. It says all of that in the first few lines of the piece. It also tells you what they are hoping to do with it. It tells you about the intentions. Now, I don't know if the intentions as written in the text necessarily correspond to Sam Gold's intentions with this piece, and, you know, from a lofty artistic standpoint, I'm not sure I can infer precisely what Sam Gold's intentions are here, other than to allow a young audience to have a great time and to deliver vibes. But what this whole sequence also does is it means everyone is cheering and screaming and having this joyous introduction from the beginning of a Shakespeare play, of a damn Shakespeare play. You have this youthful audience in the theatre loving Shakespeare. It's crazy exciting to me. So now let's talk about some of the features of this production beyond that introductory sequence. What Sam Gold seems to uplift him more than anything else is a sense of joy and euphoria. It is also very queer in its approach. A lot of this feels a little bit performative where it comes to individual characters and moments of sort of unspoken, passionate intensity between a couple of characters. There are a couple of sort of almost romantic exchanges between Fellows of the Montagues and the Capulets. That does nothing for me, really, because that feels like performative queerness, and it also kind of steps on the toes of Romeo and Juliet being the significant romance that transcends the battle lines. But in its aesthetic and in its sensibility, it also feels But it's in its aesthetic and in its sensibility where it also feels queer, and that's something I have a lot more time for, because that's one of the ways in which it just feels connected to a youthfulness, to being very Gen Z, to being very of the young people now. It feels authentically like an actual group of young people behaving in the way that young people would, and the queer aesthetic and the mood of the piece all relate to that very strongly. So things that this production does well: comedy, levity, joy, euphoria, romance, passion. What we lack a little bit is the darkness that sits underneath all of that. Romeo and Juliet is a story about this love that comes out of hate, and it's the hatred and the rivalry between these two households that is not felt as acutely here. One of the reasons for this is to do with the characters that have been featured in this piece. Shakespeare is often adapted in slightly different ways, and in this one, the minor characters of the Montagues, Romeo's parents, have been entirely excised. We do not meet them, we do not hear from them, no one is playing them during this production. We do, however, have the Capulets. These are sometimes condensed into one parent. Here they are two separate parents, two distinctly separate parents, but portrayed by the same performer. And in the show's first act, this is more often than not used to comic effect, with this one performer portraying both in a very, very, very light-hearted way. We lack an awful lot of weight in the exchanges between Juliet and her parents. We lack Romeo's parents whatsoever. So what we're left with is, references to this feud between the Montagues and the Capulets, but we don't meet the Montagues, and the Capulets don't seem to be angry with anyone. They're quite happy to have anyone coming to the party with the Jack Antonoff music. Like, they don't mind. They're very chill. They're incredibly chill. And while the two households are described as both alike in dignity, they have rarely been described as chill in previous productions, and this, I think, is what makes it hard to generate tension in that first act. By the time we get to the second act, tension is a necessity. People have died, and it's very funereal. There's a lot of mourning, there's a lot of grief. Suddenly, the Capulets are either sorrowful or hugely angered, and Juliet's father, who in the first act refused to offer her hand to Paris, a young suitor, on her behalf, because he wanted to respect her wishes and have Paris woo his daughter. He demands this of her in the second act. There is this big change of pace because of the events which have unfolded. Unbeknownst to him, she is already married in secret to Romeo. But we do have this big shift in this production specifically from the first act to the second, where tonally we end up in this completely different place, and it hasn't been foreshadowed well enough. True enough, there is violence in the first act. We begin with a little bit of violence, but we characterize it with such comedy. This spiteful confrontation that initiates the piece that happens between some of the Montague loyalists and the Capulets is done with a sort of a nervousness, like he bites his thumb at them and then he scarpers away into the audience. It's done for laughs, and it's not done to feel like a legitimate, intense confrontation, which is exactly what it was in the Jamie Lloyd version earlier this year. Interestingly enough, though, this one actually portrays the violence, which the Jamie Lloyd one didn't do. That was very standing feet apart, talking into microphones and angrily whispering at each other, and then occasionally someone will, after a blackout, be covered in blood. This one, we see the violence, and the violence is credited in the playbill, not as fight direction, but simply as violence, and it's credited to Drew Leary, who did a great job. Most of this we see at the end of the first act. This is about to be a little bit of a spoiler, but we have this moment where Tybalt, one of the kinsmen of the Capulets, kills Mercutio while Romeo is trying to intervene, because Romeo by this point is trying to broker a sort of a peace between the two families, because he knows this is a necessity for his relationship with Juliet. Mercutio does not take all of this well. While Mercutio is lying there dying, declares a plague on both of their houses, which is very rich coming from Mercutio, who is, incredibly participatory in the whole thing up to this point until dying. Anyway, Tybalt comes back and is murdered by Romeo out of this impassioned revenge and this just sudden seeing red. And what's so interesting about the way that all of this is staged is there is this fearful quality about all of it. They feel very strongly, and Tybalt is very passionate, Romeo is very passionate, and everyone around them is participating in this fight sequence, but they're doing it like young people who haven't necessarily killed before. They have scrapped before, they have fought before, they have insulted each other, but it's not like this ongoing militaristic gang warfare, which is how it can feel in other productions of Romeo and Juliet. It can feel more like really all-out war between these two families. This one, it doesn't. It feels like they are slightly scared young people, which is super interesting. As part of this collaboration, there's also movement and choreography by Sonia Tyre. And there are moments of music in this as well, which have been provided by Jack Antonoff, written by Jack Antonoff. And this comes in two forms. There is incidental music that sits beneath the entire thing, underscoring its moments of tension and romance and inspiration and darkness and sorrow. And I love all of that and have an awful lot of time for it. There are also a couple of moments of out-and-out singing and singing of original music. Rachel Zegler as Juliet sings a song at the Capulet ball when Romeo notices her for the first time. I have a lot of time for this moment because dramaturgically there's reason for her to be singing, whatever. She also sings at the end of the first act. She sings a song called Man of the House, where there's a little bit of a disconnect between the lyrics that she's singing and the mood of the whole thing, because it comes at a moment of grief that she hasn't yet discovered in character as Juliet. Romeo has just murdered her cousin out of revenge, this setting in motion the circumstances that will lead to their death. Their love and their marriage and their relationship and their future together is doomed in this moment, but she is singing a song about him. It feels very I Feel Pretty from West Side Story, because that does a similar thing dramatically, where she is singing a joyous song even though we as the audience know that her joy is already lost. This I don't think is quite as effective. I just don't think it really enriches the piece or adds anything to it other than giving us a sort of a familiar way to end the first act as a contemporary audience who are maybe more used to the world of musical theatre than they are to Shakespeare, and sure, why not? I started to wonder if I would enjoy these moments more if they were musicalized sonnets, which is something that happens in other Shakespeare adaptations. Just off the top of my head, there is a film adaptation of The Tempest with Reeve Carnian where he sings a musicalized version of a Shakespeare sonnet. I think it's O Mistress Mine. And there is so much poetry and there's so much text to pull from to musicalize in those moments, and then we wouldn't have this discrepancy between the language spoken within the play and these sung moments. It would all still feel Shakespearean, and I think that would lend an authenticity to these musical moments that would situate them a little bit more within the world of the play rather than feeling like a departure. Speaking of departure, there are a couple more song moments in the second act, but there is one in particular that really confused and or bothered me when the actor playing Paris, during a moment of real lowness and grief after Juliet's body has been discovered, but prior to her actually being dead, so at this point she's just, she's a possum, she's a Shakespearean possum. He runs up to the DJ booth. He runs out into the audience and speaks to the person on the DJ booth and demands that they play the song "Tonight We Are Young," and has the audience start to sing along with him on that. The DJ does not go along with this, and he threatens to fight them and then runs back off stage again. It's a nice little cute comedic moment, but it flies in the face of the grief and the angst and the sorrow that we have just been, led to experience. And that is also sort of characteristic of this production, is that there are many light comedic moments in the second act that pierce the darkness of the whole thing. It doesn't do the grief, the sorrow, the weight, the heaviness, the despair with full conviction. It lets us off the hook a little bit. So I was really enthralled and delighted and overjoyed in the first act. I don't think I ever felt true despair in the second. It didn't make me cry. It didn't nearly make me cry. But let's go back to that first act and talk about some of the specific staging choices that really delighted me. So the scenic design was by Dots, and the whole thing was in the round, so we didn't have giant set pieces and flats or whatever, because that would obstruct sightlines from different parts of the audience. We had this circular playing space, and we had two raised platforms on either side of that, where Romeo and Juliet initially sit while watching the action unfold before their arrivals into the piece, which happens a little way into the first act. But the entire production spilled out beyond that as well. We had Kit Connor as Romeo running up the stairs through the audience, playing scenes, standing amongst the standing room only sections of the audience, glancing down into the center towards Juliet, situating him literally among the people as he is addressing, saying, "Oh my gosh, I can see her. There's a light through her window. She's talking about me." Running delightedly, enthusiastically, joyously, a young man in love throughout the auditorium, not only indicating the passion he's feeling in this moment, but truly getting his steps in and doing a little bit of cardio. This is likely my favorite piece of staging within the entire piece, because she is on a bed that has lowered from the ceiling above. Now, up in the ceiling, there are all of these walkways among the lighting rigs where people are walking around, and occasionally scenes are played there as well. There's a moment where Gabby Beans as Mercutio is leaning down across one of these raised walkways. It's a very cool effect. And it's also not just spectacle for the sake of it, because this has Rachel elevated and separated and fully out of the reach of Kit as Romeo, which is the whole point of the balcony scene. There is this space that separates them. I talked about this in the Duke of York's West End production that Jamie Lloyd directed, and how the scene can't really work if they're within reach of each other, because he wants to reach out and grab her, and if he can reach out and grab her, then he'd just do that. We need to see this space. There needs to be an obstacle to be overcome, and in this production it's that she is fully elevated and he can't get to her. Now, on the stage below, a semicircle of it has lifted up and turned over and revealed this bed of multicolored flowers, the arrival of this being at a moment in the play when we are feeling love and joy and hope. Towards the end of the first act, the whole thing closes again, kind of indicative of the fact that this hope is dead. It's gone. The possibility of a happy ending here is lost to us forever, and joy is going to be absent going into the second act. While the flowers are there, the characters are lying among the flowers. It looks beautiful, and we have this moment in the balcony scene that has been much talked about, where Kit as Romeo runs back in after having left because she calls him back, and he's delighted by this, so he leaps up with joy and grabs the bar of the bed, and then he does a pull-up to go up and kiss her. It's incredibly romantic, it's stirring, it's charming, it's just a wonderful piece of staging that delivers the necessity of that moment and their separation, but also finds such joy and such romance. Joy and romance being the components of this production that work beautifully. I also want to credit the work of Claire Warden, who is the intimacy director on this production. The chemistry between these two as Romeo and Juliet is so wonderful, is so believable, is such an important factor of this working. The other factor that is a little bit more absent here is the rivalry between the households, and it's those two things that drive any production of Romeo and Juliet to success. We do the romance and the chemistry so well that you can still have a great time even when that other thing is a little less clearly delivered. I also want to talk about Enver Shakatash's work on the costume design, and as I talk about this, I want to talk to you about the multi-rolling that happens in this production and its approach to gender, which again feels very Shakespearean because you just have this group of players playing the story and it doesn't feel racially specific, it doesn't feel gender specific. Like, admittedly, we once again have the casting where we have a white man playing Romeo and a woman of colour playing Juliet, which is something that we see a little bit too often as far as I'm concerned, but that is not indicative of a production that uses racial disparity as a metaphor for the conflict between these two families. They just hate each other for the sake of it, and, like I said, that's not really explicated. Here we don't talk much about that using the storytelling language of this production, but it's certainly not racially motivated. And you have Tommy Dorfman playing the nurse and also playing Tybalt, the nurse being characterized with an extraordinary amount of femininity and guile and sass even, and Tybalt being characterized with a sort of a resentment and a fury that transcends gender. And Gabby Beans does interesting things as well as Mercutio and also Friar Lawrence, where Mercutio feels very masculine and Friar Lawrence it's sort of just characterized with wisdom and with grace and with a peacefulness that again transcends gender. And there's more dual casting throughout this production. Tahim Modak plays both Benvolio and the apothecary, but Sola Fadaran, I guess, is the other conspicuous one for playing both Lord and Lady Capulet, Juliet's father and mother. And while there is a distinct difference between the way that the two are characterized, which is used to comic effect in the first act, it's less about portraying gender and it is more about this shift from compassion to rage, both of which are played incredibly well. This is a fantastic performance, which we'll talk about more in the next section when I talk about the performances. But like I said, what I find really interesting is the way that these roles have been allocated, and the nurse and Tybalt makes perfect sense because these are characters who are endeared to the same purpose and who have a connection. After Tybalt's death, the nurse mourns for Tybalt, and Tybalt has this leather jacket with a red pattern on the back that the nurse wears out of grief, and then Juliet then wears to meet with Friar Lawrence and to meet with Paris when she is pretending to grieve for Tybalt, for her cousin, when in reality she is more consumed with thoughts of her accused, banished husband Romeo, and so she's wearing the jacket out of performative grief, which I think is so smart, and we've had that explained to us because the nurse has done it first. And the fact that you can have one performer, by the way, playing both of those roles, playing the nurse and Tybalt, and wearing elements of the same costume, and we still understand who they are in different contexts. That's good direction. That's smart, because that's difficult to pull off. This could be very confusing. Gabby Beans has a sort of like a waistcoat vest type thing that she puts on when she's playing Friar Lawrence, and there is a moment where she says, "I'm the friar now," which again is used for comedy, but also just helps us to understand who we are looking at that point, and thereafter it's incredibly clear to tell the difference between the two characterizations because she delivers them in a very different way. But bringing these two characters together I find so interesting because their union, I suppose, is the function they provide to the plot, but also to Romeo specifically. These are the voices of reason and advice. For Mercutio, it's the whole Queen Mab monologue in the first act, where Mercutio is sort of acting as this, not parental figure, but certainly this wiser figure to Romeo and dispensing advice, which is also the facility of Friar Lawrence throughout the rest of the play. But it's so interesting to bring them together because they're not even necessarily ideologically aligned, because Friar Lawrence is supposedly ambivalent to all of the conflict that is happening here and neutral in terms of the feud between these two families, where Mercutio very much isn't, even in spite of the dying statement of a plague on both thy houses. The rest of the costuming very much in keeping with all of the vibes that I've been talking about in this. It's all very Gen Z, it's all very on trend. I love some of the use of props as well. There's a giant teddy bear that is just on one of these platforms throughout, and only really gets used when the apothecary tears it open and pulls the drugs that he is giving to Romeo to poison himself with out of the bear. That's one of the moments, like I said, where we sort of inject perhaps an unhelpful amount of comedy into an otherwise very dark scene, but it's one of the things that makes it play well to this audience. And ultimately, in spite of the sacrifices that we make in order for this to be as compelling, as engaging, as down-to-earth, accessible, and fun as it is, I don't need this to be a definitive, perfect production of Romeo and Juliet. I am delighted enough that it is a modern, a contemporary, a youthful, an energetic, a queer, and a joyous production of Romeo and Juliet. I think so often we lead with the tragedy, we lead with the darkness, we lead with the conflict, and this one, it puts that on the back seat, for better or for worse. It leads with joy and euphoria and youthfulness. It feels so young, and that's why I like it. Finally, let me tell you about the performances of this very talented company. Now, I'm a big fan of the show Heartstopper. I was very excited to see Kit Connor on stage, but all of that aside, he is remarkable in this. He is giving an astonishing performance, far stronger than anything else I have ever seen him do. He is incredible in that. He's Tony nomination good as Romeo in Romeo and Juliet, and he captures that thing that's very hard to do, which is this multifaceted, nuanced love, and this overwhelming, wide-eyed, love at first sight thing. He reminded me very much of a young Jude Law, even a young Taron Egerton. What we are seeing here, I think, is the birth of a hugely exciting leading man who is going to have an enormous Hollywood career, and we're very lucky to be getting him on the stage right now in this capacity. And he delivers this really well-rounded Romeo on all fronts, where he finds the aggression and he also finds the softness and the romance, but it's those scenes where he's first meeting Juliet and where he's falling completely in love with Juliet and everything thereafter being motivated by his feelings for her and by this extraordinary heart that he exposes on stage. The way he can colour that with so many different emotions and so much wonderment and this wide-eyed, truly like star-crossed, beautiful thing that he creates on stage. It's so surprising. It is so truthful. Honestly, how he finds the energy and the presence to, at each performance, be so infused with such authentic falling in love and discovery and shock. It's really, really a very special thing. And it's physicalized perfectly as well. It runs throughout his body in this sort of a nervous energy as he is running around the auditorium, as he does the jump and the pull-up and everything that he does with this, as he is rolling around in the flowers on stage. He so perfectly captures a young person falling in love, truly falling in love for the first time. And this has been set up well from the beginning of the play, where his feelings for Rosaline are characterized a little bit differently. This is another conspicuous issue I had with the Jamie Lloyd one, where he had Tom Holland directed at the beginning of the thing to be in abject, sorrowful despair about Rosaline, so much so that he had nowhere to go with his feelings for Juliet, and it just seemed like he was crying about a different girl every day of the week. Kit's Romeo, however, is distinctly annoyed at the beginning, but the moments of the text that they really choose to uplift within that first section make it clear that his feelings are more about the inaccessibility of Rosaline, that he can't get to her and that he can't sleep with her even, and it feels more rooted to that than this all-consuming love of every fibre of her being that we then see with him and Juliet. It is a completely different thing, and he has so much room to grow into that love that we then meet later. And again, he just feels, I mean, he is very young, but he feels so youthful in all of the choices that he makes. There is a moment with the nurse and Friar Lawrence in the second act when he is learning about the futility of their love and the precariousness of his situation after he has killed Tybalt, after he has been banished, where he grabs a knife and he tries to stab himself and they stop him and he breaks down in tears afterwards and he is comforted by the nurse, and it feels so much like a decision motivated by this naivety and this youthful foolishness, as does much of his aggression. It doesn't come from a place of anger and rage, it comes from a place of sadness for his friend and passion. It's all so passionate. And his delivery of the text is also some of my favourite. I think I will just have a preference for an English accent delivering Shakespeare, and his is not the only one in this production. But in general, if you have strong feelings about the way that Shakespeare is spoken, this might be a little bit harder to listen to because they're doing an incredibly contemporary thing with it where they are playing on certain lines and it is infused with a very modern sensibility. This is not Shakespeare as poetry. The lines are not able to sing, but that happens a little more so when Kit is delivering the text. He's also just very good at Shakespeare and bringing light and meaning and clarity to the words that he says. You understand his intention every single sentence, every single line. Now, he truly shines in this production as Romeo, and Rachel Zegler's performance alongside him perhaps feels a little less strong by comparison, but it also feels that little bit mischaracterized because her Juliet from the beginning is very willful, is a little wise beyond her years, is a little bit sarcastic. It's quite apart from her portrayal of Maria in West Side Story, and perhaps there's a very real possibility that she didn't just want to replicate this version of a Juliet character that she had played before, but it's more indicative almost of a lot of other Shakespearean heroines, like your Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing. I think that would actually be a role that would suit Rachel Zegler a little bit better than Juliet, because she seems reluctant here to play the inherent youthfulness and foolishness and narrow-mindedness of Juliet when she is so consumed by this love that she sort of stands apart from any grief for her cousin, for her family members who he has slain, because, the love is the only thing that she can think of. She is a very young girl in that regard. And Rachel's performance doesn't quite capture that. She also doesn't quite find the same kind of inspiration and spontaneity when speaking to or about Romeo that he finds, and so we have this thing in the final moments of the play when he kills himself first and then she awakes and kills herself second, where the energy dips that little bit because we had the romantic intensity of his monologue and then we don't quite capture the same thing in hers. This is where I am glad to have some of the musical moments, because I think she really shines when she is singing, and inevitably we are going to see her in a Broadway musical at some point. Ultimately, when you have the screen actors going to the stage, so often they choose to do Shakespeare as this prestigious, legitimate thing, and, fair enough, and this is a great production, so I don't mind on this occasion, but I also think both of these sing. It would be lovely to see both of them in a musical, but completely Rachel Zegler. Inevitable that she's going to do musical theatre. Now, many fantastic performances in the supporting cast. I've already mentioned Sola Fadaran, who plays Lord and Lady Capulet, and the strength of their performance alone almost justified this tonal shift from the first to the second act, because Capulet's perspective so changes with the death of Tybalt and this exchange that he has with Juliet and the nurse in this sequence where he's demanding that she marry Paris is so thunderous, is so powerful. There's a little bit of a discarding of one very consequential line where he says, go to the church on Thursday or never speak to me again, something to that effect. And a little disappointing to me that was cast aside as much as it was, but the intensity found within the characterization in that moment was brilliant, was shuddering, in fact. We didn't get to see that much of Paris, played by Gian Perez, but I really enjoyed the few moments that he had. It was when he had the scene with Friar Lawrence and Juliet that we really began to understand the nature of his characterization and his portrayal in this version of Romeo and Juliet. Tommy Dorfman I thought was quite wonderful as the nurse, and Tybalt especially, really portraying the intensity of the grudge and the feud between the two families more so than anyone else on stage, and kind of single-handedly carrying the weight of that entire plot point on her back. And as the nurse, very funny, very warm, very sassy, like I said, a lot of really winning comedic moments, and then this grief and this conflict in the second act with the sorrow for Tybalt, but then also the allegiance to Juliet, all of that conflict, very well played. But perhaps the standout performance among the supporting cast, Gabby Beans as Mercutio and Friar Lawrence. Just a masterful delivery of so much of the text. And Gabby was the one who had the handheld microphone. I mentioned right at the beginning that I would talk about this a little bit more because it was a big feature of the Jamie Lloyd production. Jamie Lloyd loving microphones as he does. Only really used here to denote moments where Gabby, as a sort of a narrator figure, would explain consequential things that were happening within the narrative, decisions made by the prince, implications for Romeo, sort of stage directions almost. And this was kind of in keeping with the idea of Gabby as this character of wisdom and of knowledge and of sound good advice. Her Friar Lawrence finds some really incredible pathos, but it's her Mercutio, it's the Queen Mab speech that slowly finds this simmering intensity and this little bit of danger It's the callousness, but also the charisma. It's a really brilliant Mercutio. It's this little bit fatigued. It's this little bit indifferent. It's this little bit older. It's also contemporary. It's also vibrant. It's also distinctly American and distinctly current, and just a really great way of conceiving a Shakespearean character in a completely new light, a completely modern light, and in doing that completely perfect for this production, because that's kind of its entire deal and kind of its entire ethos. I had a great time at Romeo and Juliet. The vibes are immaculate. There's nothing else I can really tell you about it. Like I said, I will do another video where I compare and contrast with the Jamie Lloyd directed production that I've alluded to a few times in this review, because I do think the comparison is so interesting. But this one, it's just so romantic, it's joyous, it's everything I've been saying for the past hour as I've been sat here talking about it. I would love to know what you think next. If you have seen this production already, comment down below with all of your thoughts and feelings. I had a great time. I hope you did as well. Those are my thoughts. I hope you have enjoyed this review. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications if you're seeing this on my theatre-themed YouTube channel. Make sure to follow me on whatever podcast platform you may be hearing this on. Go find me across the rest of the internet. I'm at MickeyJoTheatre, and I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!